Welcome to our podcast, Simply Be Kind. If this is your first time listening, this podcast is a series of conversations with people about kindness. We hope that today's episode inspires you to do one kind thing today because it's easy to simply be kind. How important is communication and how important is it being kind when you're communicating? Often, when we're in a rush, we're so worried about outcome or getting to the outcome that we forget about kindness. So, to talk about that, we have Matt. Matt Abrahams is a leading expert in communication with decades of experience as an educator, author, podcast host, and coach. As a lecturer in organizational behavior at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, he teaches popular classes in strategic communications and effective virtual presenting. He's received Stanford GSB's Alumni Teaching Award in recognition of his teaching students around the world. Outside of the classroom, Matt is a sought after keynote speaker and a communications consultant. If that isn't enough, his online talks also garnered millions of views, and he hosts the popular award-winning podcast Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast. And he also has a book that is out now. His book is called Think Faster, Talk Smarter: How to Speak Successfully When You're Put on the Spot. And it's available on Amazon. Thank you so much for being here.
I am super excited to be here with you. And I think kindness is so important in general, but specifically in communication.
I'm so glad you agree. So I'd like to bring up a personal story and a personal thing that happened to me. As if someone that's looked at my CV sort of knows that I've sort of jumped around a bit. Like I've had a bunch of workplaces that I've been at. I was at one workplace that was very, I'd say, like a fast-paced work environment where there was just a lot of deadlines that needed to be met all the time, which meant that I was always on my toes. And because that got too much, I resigned and then I went to another company that was so snail paced that I would just have deadlines once a month or once a quarter or something. Like it was so snail paced to the point where I was worried that I wasn't sharp enough. And after that, I joined a company that had a good pace, a regular pace, and that sort of was good for me. But that was good for me in the beginning because at the beginning, I was very confident. I knew what I was doing, I was getting everything right. And then eventually, I started making mistakes. And over time, the more mistakes I made, the more underconfident I started feeling. And I think eventually I just struggled to speak up. I stopped asking for help and I tried figuring out everything on my own. Like I would read up online or I would ask everyone else except my boss for clarification because I was just so scared to speak up. And I don't know where that fear came from. I think it, and of course I was in environments where I would either be not be spoken to my boss because there was no deadlines versus the fast-paced environment where I was always being asked, where's the project? Where's the project? And so for me, I think I just in the end, when I started making mistakes, I started feeling really bad and I just didn't know how to ask for help. So, and I know that I'm not alone. Do you think that other people are like me where they struggle to ask for help?
Absolutely. Many people struggle asking for help, partly because they don't know what help they need, but partly because many of us carry around this notion that asking for help has two aspects that make it hard. One, we feel that it makes us look weak or uncertain or perhaps unable. And at the same time, we don't want to be bothersome to other people. They've got their own life, their own work. So asking for help is a really big challenge, equivalent to asking for feedback, right? That can be really challenging for people as well. And I think the roots and causes of that are very similar.
Mhm. And how do people get the motivation to ask? Because when you're stuck in a situation where you need help, and sometimes when deadlines are approaching, and the obvious answer is to ask for help, is to ask your boss for like suggestions and feedback. How do people sort of get over that mental block?
Well, so I think a couple things. First, that we need to understand that in a work environment,
Mhm.
Feedback is a really important currency, right? Feedback helps you do things, and when others give you feedback that make you better or more confident or more efficient, it benefits not just you, but it benefits them and the company at large. So part of it is just a mindset change to understand that it's actually an obligation to seek out feedback. Feedback is not admitting weakness. Feedback is admitting the desire to grow and to benefit. So appreciating that. Now, one of the best ways to get feedback is to be a good giver of feedback as well. If you exist in a culture where giving and getting feedback are the norm, then when you really need some feedback, it's much easier. So one of the things I encourage people to do is to give feedback and appropriate feedback. Ask if people are open to feedback, and feedback isn't always critical. It's really important, especially as a leader, to give positive feedback as well. So when you give negative feedback taken together with the positive, somebody says, this person really cares about me, right? If all you do is give negative feedback, the feelings are different. So one is to understand that there's an obligation to seek out feedback and an obligation to give feedback. The other thing that can make it easier is to ask questions or frame a way of thinking about asking for feedback so it doesn't feel like it's such a big ask. So instead of saying, can you help me better do this job? You might ask somebody, when you were first learning to do this job, how did you approach it? What helped you accomplish it? So through asking a question that helps you get at the same information without directly asking for feedback, that might make it easier.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm also wondering if there's a wrong time to ask for feedback.
Certainly. I think you can. I think there are better and worse ways to
Mm-hmm.
ask for feedback. I think one of the things that can get in the way of being effective in asking for feedback is the tone. If you're demanding, and if you are too generic in the feedback. So if you say, "How can I get better?" versus how can I get better at this specific task, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the more specific the feedback you're asking for, the more likely you are to get better feedback. So just being generic, I think, can be a problem.
All right, that makes sense.
One
Um,
other thing I'll add, sorry, is that make sure the person you're asking the feedback of is in a space or place where they can actually give the feedback, right?
mhm.
So it might be, you might be better served by asking for a late feedback later. So you could ask the person speaking one to one. You could send an email or some kind of message where you help them, give them time to prepare the feedback. Ambushing somebody and saying, "How do I do this better right now?" is not really going to increase the likelihood of getting good feedback.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point, and that's a good idea to kind of recognize the space the other person is in, and sort of
Yes,
just be mindful and be kind to that person, and just realize that okay, if this person seems a bit flustered, or if this person's worried about another deadline that they might have, maybe we should sort of think and come back later, circle back later, and sort of get back to them later, and then ask questions.
absolutely. And it gives them a chance to really think through. You know, I've seen people ask for feedback when people they were seeking feedback from didn't really understand what was going on. And that led to a bad dynamic. So if you say, "Hey, tomorrow, can you give me some feedback on how I can be more efficient in this process?" That gives people the time to think it through or to learn things they need to learn so they can be maximally effective for you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Since we've spoken about how to take care of how someone else is feeling during a certain time, I'd want to pivot this to maybe it could be something in the workplace, but also not a workplace thing. So even if it's outside the workplace, or if it's amongst colleagues, or amongst the networks that you're in, or amongst friends and families, I think it's important, like I said, to be kind. And also, what happens is when we're speaking to people, and like I mentioned in the beginning, that we're so rushed to getting to the point. We so want to get to the point that we forget about kindness. We think that it's very important for my message to come across without thinking, is the other person open to receiving it? So my question to you is, how important is it to be kind in just two-way conversations in general?
Absolutely. So to me, the most important the biggest mistake people make in communication is we are self-focused. We think about here is what I want to say or I need to say, rather than thinking about what does the audience need to hear. So being audience centric is critical. In other words, it's about being empathetic. There are some people who believe that the whole reason our species learned to communicate was to express empathy. So if you think about that, and to me, empathy and kindness are very related, right? So if I take the time to really appreciate what you need in the moment, that's a gift. That's a form of expressing kindness. So I think it's critical. I think it's the foundation of effective communication. So we have to be other focused, audience centric, and that's what allows us to be empathetic and ultimately to be kind. So the answer to your question is kindness is key. And the way we achieve it is by really thinking about the needs of the people we're communicating with in the moment.
Yeah, I think there's also this thing called interconnectedness, which is basically you sort of uh, be mindful of the fact that it's not just you in the world, there is another person, and your life sort of not very dramatically, but your life depends on them, their life depends on you. The
Mm-hmm.
way you interact with them shapes their whole life and vice versa. So it's very important to remember that whatever you say can have a huge impact on someone else's life or on their day, and just to be mindful and be kind of that.
I think that's lovely. I like that a lot.
Yeah. But okay, what about in situations where people forget to be kind? Like in the heat of the moment, they've said something bad, or for example, if we take a workplace example, the a boss gives bad feedback. I mean, not bad feedback, but gives uh constructive feedback that is taken negatively, and the person in the team sort of reacts instead of responding and says that, no, but I worked on this project really well, these are my points, this is why I did this, and they sort of start defending themselves, and then maybe after a moment they kind of realize, oh wait, she like the boss is right. What does someone do in a situation where they have to make up for like a miscommunication that has happened?
I believe in the power of apology. And, I think it's really important when you have a realization that something you have done or something you've interpreted was not correct or as accurate as you thought. I think it's really important to apologize and to admit the mistake and then to talk about what you're doing better. In my new book, which is all about how to speak in the moment, most of our communication is spontaneous. It's
Mhm.
not the plan, presenting, or pitches or meetings. It happens in the moment in the interaction. And I talk about in the second part of the book, I give examples of specific types of communication that are spontaneous. And one is apologies. And I give a structure to help people navigate a roadmap, if you will, of how to apologize well. So the first thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge the transgression, whatever it is. So you say, I am sorry that I did this. Many of us, when we apologize, we distance ourselves from it. So I might say something like, I'm sorry that you feel bad. Well, that's not me apologizing, but I might say, I'm sorry that I embarrassed you in front of your colleagues. That's
Mhm.
me owning what I did. Um, and then you want to secondarily acknowledge the feelings that the person might have. And in so doing, I probably embarrassed you and made it very uncomfortable. And then the third part is to make amends, to say, here's what I will do differently next time. uh, I might say something like, before I interrupt, I'll wait till you're done and I'll be sure to paraphrase what it is you said before I add in my comment. So by apologizing for a misinterpretation or a misdeed, I think that's how you reestablish a good relationship and express kindness towards the other person. You're taking the time to acknowledge not just what you've done, but how it makes the other person or potentially makes the other person feel. So that's how I would address those circumstances.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point because this is something that I've noticed about apologies, and I actually heard this advice in a TV show.
Uh-huh.
But So, I mean, there was this show called America's Next Top Model, which was quite famous back in the day. But
Yes.
yeah, so what I realized people would say is, I'm sorry if it hurt you. And, they'd use the word if. And I realized
Right.
that using the word if shifts the responsibility of you. It isn't you owning something that you did wrong. It's saying that I'm sorry that you feel upset, or I'm sorry that you, like you said, I'm sorry that you feel this. I'm sorry if this might hurt you. And it still puts responsibility on the other person. And you're right, where you have to sort of take ownership and say that.
Right. Right. By owning it. And that's an act of kindness, right? By accepting what you've done.
Yeah. All right. So we are almost at the end of this episode. And because I am a little hungry for more information, I am going to ask you one more question, which is
Sure.
which is how do you what are some top 5 ways that someone can be kind to someone, especially if they're meeting someone for the first time?
Oh, excellent. That's a great question. So there is, I have a newfound friend.
Mhm.
Her name is Rachel Greenwald. She is both an academic, but also a matchmaker. She helps people find romantic partners. And she has this wonderful saying: it is more important to be interested than interesting. And I love that idea. One way you are kind to people when you first meet is by taking time to really meet them, to listen, to appropriately respond, to be interested, right? Sharing our attention is a gift. Our attention is pulled in so many different directions. Taking the time to really focus and listen is a gift, and that's an act of kindness. So that's the first thing. Be interested, not necessarily interesting.
Mhm.
Another thing I would suggest is paraphrasing. I think paraphrasing is a wonderful way to demonstrate kindness. It demonstrates that you're really listening and that you're interested in making sure that you got the information correct. Paraphrasing is not repeating word for word what somebody says. It's really distilling down to the bottom line of what they're trying to get across. So when you paraphrase, as you have done an excellent job of tonight when I've responded,
Mhm.
it really does make me feel like you care because you're taking the time to listen and demonstrate that listening. So those are two fundamental ways. Non-verbally, we do a lot in terms of our voice. Our tone should be open and warm. Our body should be facing the person we're talking to, or when we're virtual, looking at the camera as if I'm looking at you when I speak. We want to be open. We don't want to be closed. So there are lots of ways that we signal immediacy, intimacy, and kindness through not just the words we say, but also through the way we position our body and use our voices. So in there, I think I gave 4 or 5. I hope that gives me at least full credit or partial credit on answering your question.
No, no, those were really good points. Yeah, I really like the point about being interested versus interesting, because this
Yeah.
is something that I've noticed a lot, especially I'd say in like the older generation that I see, like my parents' generation, where everyone is so worried. I don't know if worry is the right word, but they make it their point to talk about themselves. They want to be interesting so bad that they forget to listen, where someone
Mhm.
is telling their story, but they just like I think the first thing that they're thinking about is how do I respond in a way that makes me sound interesting. And I think
Right. And when you're doing that, you're not listening.
exactly, yeah. So I think that is like a really big lesson that a lot of people need to learn and just need to imbibe, and that just makes conversations a whole lot better after that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can do it very simply when somebody answers a question or tells you something. Give what's called a supporting response.
Mhm.
Follow up with interest instead of changing the topic. When you communicate, you can either invoke what are called supporting responses or shifting responses. So
Mhm.
if you tell me you just traveled to some wonderful destination, I can say, "Oh, tell me more. What did you do there?" That's a supporting response. That's demonstrating kindness, listening, compassion. But if you say, "Hey, I just traveled to this great destination," and I say, "Hey, I traveled to someplace cool too," do you see how I just shifted,
Yeah.
right? And that's a little more self-serving. Now, you don't always want to be supporting and never shifting, because that looks like you're trying to avoid revealing anything about yourself, which is not kind. So you want to shift occasionally, but the focus should be on supporting.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. I think that was very wonderful and that was very informative. Thank you so much, Matt, for being here. I think we've all learned a lot in the time that we've been listening to this.
Well, thank you so much for the time. I love that your podcast is about kindness and that you're such a kind person. Your questions were insightful and thoughtful. It was clear you were listening, and it was clear that you were trying to ask questions that could be helpful to your viewers and listeners. So, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, to talk about my podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart, and my book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. Thank you so much.
Yes, you should definitely check out his book if you can, and you should definitely listen to his podcast if you can. It is available on Spotify and it's available on YouTube. So you should definitely check it out. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.